This is Jill Kelly on December 10th at around 3 o'clock in Chicago, Illinois, conducting an interview for the Global Oral History of PEPFAR project. And so to begin, could you start off by introducing yourself and kind of establishing your connection to knowledge about PEPFAR?
So I'm Dr. Rob Murphy, Rob for Robert. I'm a professor of medicine and biomedical engineering here at Northwestern University. I'm also the John P. Fair Professor of Infectious Diseases. And so I'm trained in infectious diseases. And on the first day of my fellowship, which I did here at Northwestern in 1981, we had our first patient with AIDS was admitted to me here at the hospital. And it was the first week of my infectious disease fellowship, and that started my whole interaction with HIV.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. So will you tell us a little bit more broadly about yourself, your family, where you're from, where you went to school?
Oh, okay. I'm from Boston, actually, from West Roxbury. We live sometime in the suburbs as well. But my whole family, both sides of the family, are from Boston. My grandfather was the park commissioner of Boston on my father's side, and on my mother's side, they had a little bakery on Center Street in West Roxbury. So very Boston upbringing. But somewhere along the line, I decided that I actually wanted to be a pilot. I moved to Carbondale, Illinois, because they had an aviation program that gave a pilot's license and an undergraduate degree. But then I was there, I got my license, but I decided I didn't want to be a commercial pilot. And I switched to medicine, and I moved back to Boston. I went to Boston University. I graduated there with a degree in biology. I worked at BU Medical Center, or at the time it was actually just called Boston City Hospital, and it had the University Medical Center. It wasn't what it is today. And I worked in a lab there with Dr. Richard Elcourt. He's a surgeon with a research lab. And I also worked at the Dimmick Medical Center, which was a center for underprivileged persons wanting to learn a trade. And I was teaching them medical technology. And then I went to medical school at Loyola, so I moved to Chicago. And I was at Loyola, where I met my future wife. We were married while I was in medical school. I ended up having 2 kids. I did my internship and fellowship here at Northwestern back then. I started, like I've mentioned, I started my fellowship in 1981 and finished in 1984. I was recruited onto the faculty. By then, the number of AIDS cases had really increased significantly. And right about that time, infectious disease was not really an outpatient type disease. It was, you either worked in a laboratory or you were consulting in the hospital. However, all of a sudden we had all these patients that needed to be seen outside the hospital as well. And as part of my duties as a fellow and as a junior attending, I had to have outpatient clinics. So I was the only infectious disease person that actually had an outpatient clinic. And that ultimately became the AIDS clinic. Yeah. And I soon got a dedicated space because I had so many patients. I teamed up with an oncologist, Dr. Jamie Von Rohen, who's at ASCO now. And Jamie and I basically started the AIDS clinic program under the supervision of Dr. John Fair, who was the first head of infectious diseases out here. So we started that, and we had a lot of patients, and it got to the point in the 80s. Remember, there's no treatment in the mid-80s. We didn't have AZT till 1987. The patients were not doing well, as you can imagine, and the average lifespan for a person coming in with pneumocystis pneumonia was only 6 months. And if they came in presenting with Kaposi sarcoma, it was 18 months. So, and the patients were very sick. So I took care of the AIDS patients in the hospital. And then there was an infectious disease service, which did all the regular infections in the hospital. So I basically started the inpatient AIDS service and the outpatient AIDS service. So I was there really at the beginning and saw everything grow. And it was very difficult back then because there was really no good treatment. We could treat the opportunistic infections, but then there was just another infection following that. It was a very trying time. And it got to the point where they only gave us so much space in the clinic, and they wouldn't give us any more space. And so we used to start at 8 o'clock. I said, well, we'll start at 7. And we filled that space up. And then we said, we'll have to start at 6. So we started at 6 o'clock. And then we were actually thinking of starting earlier. And they said, the guards don't come in until 6 o'clock. So you can't do it before 6. But then they realized there was just so many patients here. And they gave us a dedicated half of a floor in a building that used to be the Passavant Pavilion, used to be Passavant Hospital. And they gave us a half a floor because they were building these new buildings and stuff. They didn't need that anymore, and we got that. And then the hospital supported us, and we ultimately got the whole floor and ran that. We built a huge AIDS service here. So that goes on. I was the biggest admitter to the hospital, and unfortunately the biggest signer of death certificates. And I just wanted to do something other than just treat patients, even though the treatments were starting to come along and they were starting to have an effect. I wanted to have a bigger impact than that. And so I switched really more to a research mode. Okay. One of our first studies here was the MAX study, multi-center AIDS cohort study. Matter of fact, this is the 40th year of the MAX study.
Oh, wow.
Amazing. And started in 1984. And I was just finishing my fellowship, and I was the blood drawer in that study. It was a risky job back then. Yeah. And but that was an incredible project that really impacted me for a long time. And then there was the AIDS Clinical Trials Group, which focused on therapy. So that started, I don't know, it was late 80s, early 90s, because we had AZT come out in Zidovudine, the drug, in 1987, and then the other drugs followed. And by 1996, the therapy got so good, all of a sudden, people weren't dying if they could take the medication. I remember an administrator from the hospital called me and said, what happened? Did you move? Are you putting your patients someplace else? Because I always used to have so many patients in the hospital. I said, no, you got to read the newspaper. This medicine really works. I went from being the biggest admitter. 2 years later, we didn't have one patient admitted.
Oh, wow.
I didn't.
Yeah.
So that ultimately became a dull roar. But I mean, the impact was dramatic. So along the way, I became a consultant because I'm now involved in research and training and things like that. And one of my program officers at CDC asked if I would like to travel abroad and do some training. And it was for the Peace Corps. So the Peace Corps is run by the State Department. And so they had some volunteers come back from working around the world with HIV. And the treatment was not very good back then, and they're not like a health department. I mean, they're in the State Department.
Right.
So they didn't really treat the returning volunteers. Let's just say they were kind of just said, there's nothing we can do. So one of them complained to Senator Inoue in Hawaii. I don't know if they were Hawaiian themselves, or I don't know, but somehow he got involved. And he instructed Louis Sullivan, the Surgeon General, to do something about this. And so Sullivan contacted the CDC and said, get whoever does your training and get them out there to figure out what's going on in the field. And so I ended up in West Africa, training all the people that take care of Peace Corps volunteers, which is run out of the embassies. So I did that, and that sort of got me started in the whole international world, and that was in West Africa.
So as you were kind of working through these momentous times in health history here, did you have a sense of what was happening with the pandemic in Africa, or was the Peace Corps the kind of way that you started to think about that?
Well, that introduced me to what the system was over there. Okay. Because I had the caregivers, some were American, some were African, discuss, how they were handling just disease in general, let alone HIV, of the volunteers. There's thousands of volunteers out there. So it was obvious they needed some training, but they wanted it. They asked for it, so they got it. And so they did a training in South Africa. I did the one in West Africa. There was one in Asia somewhere, and there was one in Latin America. So it was the 4 trainings. And so that just started this whole process. And then I was also working a lot with the French. I just ended up with sort of working with French investigators. France has an incredible medical system, and they have an incredible research enterprise, similar to what we have here, considering that they're a much smaller country. They actually discovered the virus, as you know, and they were very aggressive in the research and in the treatment of people with HIV. Matter of fact, in France, if you were in France illegally and had HIV, you could not be deported if the country didn't have treatment for you. It's kind of the opposite of what's going on here. So I ended up working with them on some international projects and developed a good rapport with them. And while I was in Paris at one of the big hospitals there, La Pitié-Salpêtrière, which is the biggest hospital in Europe and a big AIDS treatment hospital, they have people from all over the world coming and working there for a period of time. And there was a doctor from Nigeria, Ernest Ekong. And Nigeria is an English-speaking country. I don't know how he ended up in France, because his French was about as bad as mine. And so we became good friends. And he said, "Oh, you have to come to Nigeria." Now, that was when Nigeria was under a dictatorship at the time with Abacha. And basically, there weren't too many Americans or anybody. You didn't go to Nigeria just to go there. I mean, you had to have a really good reason. There's a lot of oil people, because they're a big oil producer. But other than that, you didn't see a lot of people there. There had been a lot of disruption, and the country was really pretty chaotic. When I first got there, I said, "Ernest, I'm a little nervous about going, because every airport in the United States had a little sign that said, 'Do not travel to Murtala Muhammad Airport.'" I was in Bangor, Maine, okay? And there was a sign, "Don't go to Murtala Muhammad Airport," in Bangor, Maine. Like, what's with this airport? Yeah. And of course, that's where you go to get into the country. So I was a little nervous. He said, don't worry. I work for the military there. I'm a civilian military doctor. We'll pick you up at the airplane. You'll be fine. So sure enough, there's like 2 guys with guns and everything, and they whisk me away. I get through customs very quickly. It's always nice to have 2 guys with guns behind you. And so he took me around Lagos and Abuja and to the hospitals. I was at the 69 Military Hospital, the University of Lagos. I went up to Ibadan and into Abuja. I met the Minister of Health and all the people there. And it was a little chaotic on the streets. There were no stoplights or stop signs in a city of 20 million. But there was an amazing amount of functionality anyway. There were hospitals, there were district hospitals, there was organization, there was a staff, there were 36 medical schools. It's not as primitive as, or dangerous as, I had been led to believe. Right. And I was very comfortable there. I was there for a few weeks and met all the players. And
about what time? So you said Sani Abacha, but
so that was probably around 99, 98, 99. It was when the good therapy was available.
Okay.
Now, nobody could afford it. But right around that time, the government changed. Obasanjo, a former general who had been in prison, became president after Abacha died. He was an incredible president. I'm a big fan of his. And things improved markedly. And the hospitals got fixed up, the roads were fixed up. He really put order in and really starting to build the company. He came here to Chicago to visit Motorola. Motorola is based here. Now it's, it's the successor to Motorola, but the actual Motorola was here. And that ended up getting cell phone coverage all over the country. He did some very good things. And he said, I'm going to start the first AIDS treatment program in Africa. So he said, I'm going to treat 10,000 people. We didn't even know how many cases there were.
Right.
So there was the Gates Foundation was there in a program called AIDS Prevention Initiative Nigeria, or APIN. It was run by a doctor in the public health school there, Dr. Phyllis Kanke, and she was running that program. And that was in the days when literally Bill Gates and his father and friends would sit around a kitchen table and decide what they were going to fund. And so they funded that at $25 million for 5 years.
The Obasanjo plan?
Well, this is APIN.
APIN, okay.
So she and I were the only Americans going over there at the time. Soon, many others followed. But back then, and I think it was 99 or 2000, APIN was kind of the only thing going on. And then I was just there at the visit by Ernest Ekong from the Nigerian military. So we got together, and this plan came out from Obasanjo, and he asked the Nigerian Institute for Medical Research, or NIMR, which is located in Lagos. It's been around for a long time. It's a Nigerian institution. It's like a little mini NIH and plus treatment. We worked with them. They wanted NIMR to kind of orchestrate this problem. And then NIMR did a deal with APIN, and APIN contracted with me as I'm an MD who treats patients. They were more public health oriented laboratory people. And so I was the clinical person who set that up with some of the other people I think you've interviewed already for this program. And we trained 50 quads of a doctor, a nurse, a pharmacist, and a psychologist. And we sent them all over the country. And he purchased medication for 10,000 men, women, and children. And we distributed it through the country. They distributed it, but we were involved in the training. Okay. So that got me really embedded with them. And it was really great to see because it was one of the first programs. I don't know if it was the first, but it was definitely one of the first. And then along comes George W. Bush.
Okay, so can I pause here for a second? Because I remember this morning Dr. Achenbach saying that that there had been some funding, or there had been some efforts to do similar projects that just weren't getting funded because there were these preconceptions about Africa that you couldn't do this. Could you tell us about,
Yeah, we had some other funders that were willing to support us, some of the pharmaceutical companies, but some were against us doing anything in Africa because they were afraid of going to Nigeria. They were afraid of going to Africa in general. They were paranoid about, how we're going to control for the drugs. I mean, they were just like, no. Some companies were, okay, let's do it. And some were, no. So we had actually set up a program to do 100 patients in 10 different countries just to show that it could be done. But we had to have the drugs donated. And I'm not going to mention the company name, but one company wouldn't do it. And that's why it fell apart. Anyway, we had tried that. Yeah. But that didn't fly. And so then we did the Nigerian government program, and that worked really well. And then Bush comes along, George W. Bush comes along with PEPFAR. So PEPFAR is, as you know, is this massive public health program that was bigger than anyone ever really imagined. So to get into track 1 PEPFAR, so we were the first funding for PEPFAR was track 1.
Mm-hmm.
So the RFA came out. You had to have 3 sub-Saharan African countries that you knew that could implement this rollout of highly active antiretroviral therapy. We used to call it HART or CART, comprehensive antiviral therapy or highly active antiretroviral therapy, whatever, the stuff that works. Put enough drugs together and it actually works. So Harvard School of Public Health applied. The leader was Phyllis Kankey, who also led APIN. Phyllis is a veterinarian and a doctor of science. She's a typical public health person, does laboratory work and whatever, and she's an incredible public health expert and organized the whole thing, but she's not a medical doctor. Well, I was already there. We had already met each other. I was already a consultant to her APIN program. And so she had programs in Botswana, or Harvard had programs in Botswana, Tanzania, and Nigeria through this APIN program. And so I was part of that grant, the PEPFAR Track 1 grant, as the country director for Nigeria. Okay. And Wafai Fauzi was the country director for Tanzania, and Rick Marlink was the country director for Botswana. And each one of us had worked in those countries, for a while already. So we submitted our application to the Harvard School of Public Health.
What was that like? So what did the RFA ask for?
Well, the RFA said you had to have the 3 countries. You have to show that you've worked in there. You have to, be familiar with all the people. You had to name who you're going to work with. So we worked with NIMR,
okay.
Nigerian Institute for Medical Research, and 6 of the major universities there. Okay. So the University of Lagos, University of Ibadan, Ahmadu Bello up in Zaria in the north, Maiduguri out in the northeast, and Enugu, which is University of Nigeria in Enugu in the southeast. Those were and the 68 military hospital in Yaba, which is part of Lagos. So those were our 6 sites, big sites, and then we spread out from there. But that was the plan. It was originally $108 million. Meanwhile, the Harvard Medical School, they applied as well. So you could have 2 applications from the same place, but when you do something like that, the losers can't go work with the winners. Okay. So we get the award. We're shocked. We're really surprised. $108 million over 5 years was the original award. It was the year of the Democratic Convention in Boston. You might remember. It was 2003 or 4, I can't remember. Anyway, so we're celebrating. Barry Bloom, the dean, takes us out to dinner at Ivu, which is a restaurant right out near Harvard in Somerville. And he's like so happy, and he's trying to recruit me to come, move back to Boston and everything. The next day, Larry Summers picks up the paper and sees Harvard has this huge project in Africa, including Nigeria. He's furious. I'm not really quite sure why he was so angry. He thought it was too high risk for Harvard. Harvard, deep pockets, but the other Track 1 partners, were Columbia, the Pediatric AIDS Foundation. Some big players were involved there, and they didn't seem to mind. But anyhow, he didn't want the Harvard School of Public Health, he didn't want to accept the grant. And because the Democratic Convention was there, if Harvard had turned it down, it would have really looked bad. You're giving up on the people that need it the most. It just was all this politics going on. So he signed on, but he said, I'm only going to do it if the medical school can take over. Well, guess what? They had a grant that didn't get funded. They cannot go work on the grant that gets funded. So when that fell apart, he was furious, and they hired a executive director who was a lawyer who was basically, I think, trying to get Phyllis and me fired or quit or something. It was just, but like, we're academics. Like, hey, I got news for you. You cannot fire us.
Yeah.
They could fire me because I'm not actually at Harvard, but I had an adjunct appointment at the time. But anyhow, they got over it after a while because really almost nothing bad happened. As a matter of fact, we were so successful with that program that the $108 million ended up being something like $350 million. So Nigeria was 2/3 of the project, and the 1/3 was Tanzania and Botswana. Because Nigeria has almost 200 million people, or back then. Tanzania, I don't know, 40 million or something, and Botswana has 2 million. So, it's a very big difference between Nigeria and Botswana in particular. But I was starting medical clinics and building buildings and buying trucks and SUVs.
I'm gonna dig into all of this. And before we get there, I want to ask two questions. One is, how did you feel? But then two, I want to ask a little bit about the political question. So how did you feel, right? When they say $108 billion over 5 years, and
108 million.
108 million. Sorry, yeah.
I would like billion.
Yeah. Sorry.
Well, that was definitely the biggest thing that I had ever been involved in.
Yeah.
And I had been going. It's not like I didn't just get plunked in there. I knew people there on the ground, and had gone through with the programs from APIN, so I was familiar with the program. And I had been there for the Peace Corps, and not in Nigeria. I was in Benin, which is the country right next door. And I just thought it was great. And I actually seriously thought about taking that job at Harvard School of Public Health, moving.
Yeah.
But what happened then next was you really, like, all of a sudden, that just all fell apart. But we did the job.
So I'm going to ask all these questions about the job. But did you get a sense, was it a surprise to you when PEPFAR was announced? Had you heard that there was a major programming in the works? Or?
Well, I was really shocked that it came about because, it was a real bipartisan relationship, and it was driven, especially on the Republican side, by the evangelicals who had churches in Africa. They were the ones that convinced some of the Republican senators and stuff that this is good for the people. And that, just with other people that wanted to do good public health worldwide and try to do something with the AIDS pandemic, that was it. Mm-hmm. Jesse Helms, the senator from North Carolina for many years, he got sold basically by his church. And they got behind it, and it was a real unified effort. And Bush said, I'm going to do it. And he's a hero in Africa. Mm-hmm. They worship that guy. And this is after all the stuff going on, with the yellow cake and all that stuff going on. But the PEPFAR program was fantastic. And so we worked very closely with the embassy, with the CDC and USAID, and getting all this stuff out there. And when the United States government wants to do something, it has the mechanics to do it. And we had terrible supply issues at the beginning because there were no generic drugs in 2004. We had to just go on the open market and then compete with everybody else buying AIDS drugs at the retail price, which was very expensive. Now, even though we were buying huge amounts, but even with the money, we couldn't get it. We had this executive director person I'm going to call up the president of Bristol Myers Squibb and tell him we need cases of this stuff. And I said, go ahead, but they don't have it. And they didn't. So, it takes a while for the supply chain to adjust to kind of something like that, because there's more patients in Africa than everywhere else in the world. So, and that led to actually an agency being developed within the government to do all the procurement for us. So we were actually competing with each other. with the other Track 1 PEPFARs. So we got they're an agency to do all the supply stuff for us and for the medication and manage all that stuff. And then that actually helped with the push to get generics made, mostly in India, but also in South Africa, to they've got to manufacture just more of it. And, these small molecule drugs, especially the early ones used for HIV, their cost of goods is very low. And so, ultimately the course for combination therapy ended up around $16 a person per month.
Okay, so tell me how this rolls out then, right? So you learn that Harvard will be a Track 1 partner, and you're already thinking about supply issues. How do you roll this out? How do you get started?
Well, we had the organization, we had the key players on the ground. So we started with NIMR, Nigerian Institute for Medical Research. We started with the major universities, University of Lagos, University of Ibadan, Marubello, Maiduguri, Enugu, and the military hospital in Yaba. So, these are established institutions. So that really helped. And then we had the money. And then we had mountains of people helping us with the administrative tasks of, buying 36 pickup trucks. Because you have to move everything around.
Right.
Buying SUVs. There's no snow or anything there, but the roads are bad, and really it's better to be in a car up a little bit, and that can comfortably carry a lot of people. So we ordered all this stuff. Phyllis developed the laboratories. I developed the clinics in Nigeria, and Rick Marlink did in Botswana, and Wafai Fauzi in Tanzania. We were all doing our job, and we had multiple educational programs. There was a huge amount of training that went on. I was traveling to Nigeria or someplace in Africa probably for the first 5 years close to once a month, at least 10 times per year. Phyllis Kenke I said, look, I'll move here for a couple of years, because the other PEPFAR players, and there were ultimately different tracks after that. They usually had their own house or building or something like that. And she said, I don't want that, because they'll become more independent if we don't move in. If we move in, we'll just take over. And she was right. It was really good, because our program was the first one to become independent. We flipped over to the Nigerians at year 6. And Ernest became the program director, and I became the consultant. And so then that went for another 5 years as us as the consultants, but they were really raring to go at that particular point. And then they didn't need us, and I was gone. So, that was really an incredible 10 years. But in 2000, a couple other things happened. There was a thing called the Medical Education Partnership Initiative, MEPI. MEPI was the biggest NIH program that funded African universities directly. So we took our network from PEPFAR and got them together, and it was run out of, APIN was involved, and I think it was run out of Ibadan, I think originally, with Isaac Adewole and David Olale. And then our partners were the same partners we had for PEPFAR. And that was a program to increase the workforce that could handle the HIV patients and modernize the medical curriculum that hadn't been changed since the early 1960s, based on an old British model. But any early 1960s model, giant room where you can't understand what anyone is saying, and and then everyone just reads the books, and we completely changed everything. So MEPI went for 12 years. So that went from 2010 to 2022.
Okay.
And that was really great. And again, all that money going directly to the African universities, everything went fine. It was a huge thing.
Yeah.
So that developed more the intellectual capacity. PEPFAR did the implementation for AIDS treatment and the physical capacity development. And then what happened starting in actually 2008 was we started getting other grants from the NIH to do the science. So starting in 2008, we got our first ATRIP grant, that was AIDS International Training and Research Program, where we started training specifically groups of people to take care of all aspects of AIDS, which over there, a lot of it is tuberculosis and infections and other things. So we ended up getting probably 7 or 8 of those kind of grants, these research training grants. And then that morphed. Once we had trained all these people, well, we get better grants. We got a grant looking at HIV-associated cancers. We got another big one developing medical devices specifically to monitor or diagnose AIDS or any of its complications, which could include cancer or TB. That's still going, that grant, still going. We're in our 7th year of that grant. So these are significant ones. We have R01s. We have an R01 on oral cancer in HIV and without HIV. So it ended up being a really huge research enterprise and implementation project and capacity building that really was, it's incredible what happened over such a short period of time. If I take you over there now, you would be shocked. I mean, I like a freezer farms. We've got laboratories they can do sequencing and PCR and lateral flow assays. They can, chemistries. I mean, the where we went from 2000 to 2024 is just astronomical increase. Yeah. And that's true for all those countries. Yeah. So we're very proud about that.
Can you walk me through, so you said, you were visiting once a month as part of this kind of implement. Walk us through like a day or what a trip would look like.
Yeah, so we would go over probably for the typical minimum would be about 2 weeks minimum, and then go home for a month and come back again. Sometimes we'd stay longer. But we would fly into usually Lagos, which still a very chaotic airport. They've just built a new terminal, finally, thank God. So we would fly in there. We always had drivers that we knew pick us up, and we'd, get picked up at the airport. Very chaotic driving around Lagos. The roads have gotten better, thanks to Governor Fashola of Lagos State. He was great. He really fixed the roads and everything. And we stayed at virtually every hotel in town, and at first it was pretty rough. There was a Meridian Hotel out in Ikoyi, and there was a Sheraton Hotel kind of close to the airport, and there were other African hotels. We stayed at every kind of hotel, but it was a little bit tough at the beginning because there weren't too many and the service wasn't really that great. But that's all changed now. Now you can see it used to be Intercontinental, now it's just Continental Hotel. I mean, really nice. There's Radisson, and they even have Radisson Blue. It's all very fancy now, So, we would go there and set up. And then we were working, at the beginning, we were working on a NIMR, Nigerian Institute for Medical Research. They had a big auditorium and classrooms, and we used that kind of as our home base. And we had a warehouse there with all the drugs in it. Okay. But then we would go do site visits. So we would go all around the country, spend a week up in Jos or Maiduguri. I forgot Jos, University of Jos, one of our big sites. Maiduguri or Ahmadu Bello, Enugu. So we moved around the country a lot. We knew more in that program. We ended up learning more than most Nigerians about their own country because they don't travel as much as we do. I mean, they usually stay in their own kind of area, Maybe they go to Abuja. Everybody goes to the capital every once in a while, but they don't necessarily go to other places. Like, I said, I just came back from Maiduguri. You went to Maiduguri? Oh my God. Yeah. So, but it was just one thing after another, and we had to upgrade the facilities first and train everybody. And we would do all these trainings. We had pre and post training testing and gave certificates out, and We brought some people back to learn more about, especially laboratory stuff that takes a little bit more technical. But then through our other training grants, we brought people and gave them like master's degrees, even PhDs. We synergized the other grants that we had. So, we really built up, a big enterprise over there that exists to this day. And they're applying for their own grants now. It's great. We've transitioned to having them apply for their own grants.
In the first round, you have 5 years, and part of PEPFAR's design was embedding the reporting structure so that the American government could, hold grantees accountable. Can you tell us about the kind of planning that goes into what you do in the first 5 years, and then how you'll turn that over to
we had
your partners?
Now it's a lot more sophisticated with the databases and stuff. But we trained data entry people. We set up centers at each of our major sites to do data entry and storage. So we were using, FileMaker Pro. It's an off-the-shelf database. It's really very primitive, relatively speaking, but it was a database. And then every month we had to report all our cases, and that evolved organically over time, so that then everybody ultimately used the same program, not that one, but everybody got on the same page, and the reporting got better. But that's a good question, because you just can't do all this stuff without figuring out what happened and how many people and how many drugs do you need to order, and how many computers you had to buy and whatever. And that was before laptops, so there were very few they were big clunky ones. So we mostly had desktop computers, so we used to buy those for everybody, and everybody was very happy to have them. And at the beginning there were like no phones until Obasanjo made the deal with Motorola, and phones came kind of later, but there were like almost no landlines. It was tough to communicate, but that all that stuff just resolved over time, and they have a better cell phone coverage than we do. I go to Michigan. I live in Michigan, actually. The cell phone coverage is horrible. In Lagos or anywhere in Nigeria, it's fine. It's like, I said, how come it's better in Africa than it is here? Yeah. I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. Yeah. But they really, and everybody has a phone. Yeah. And if you have any money at all, you have a smartphone. But literally everybody has a phone, a regular old flip phone.
So you mentioned the kind of Harvard School decision that y'all are not moving there. The kind of build capacity for sooner rather than later turnover. What did it look like on the ground? How much room was there for Nigerian medical doctors and researchers to kind of shape the rollout that was happening? And
they were the Nigerians. I mentioned already have at least 36 medical schools, and they're incredibly inquisitive and really respect education. Everybody wants to go to university and become a doctor and have extramural funding and be an academic. And, the competition is really, really stiff. To make it through that system with all those people there and everything, it's tough. So you get some really highly, highly qualified people. And, it's like anywhere else. There's local politics and whatever. But, I was just impressed at the intellectual capacity was way ahead of the physical capacity. But now the physical capacity has caught up.
That's great. Okay, so Harvard has partners with the medical centers and the universities that are being used. What does it look like working with kind of other related entities on the ground, right?
Yeah,
So that the CDC, the USA, yeah.
Well, they were very successful.
Okay.
We rebuilt every medical clinic and laboratory of those 6 sites.
Okay.
However, and patients came. I mean, it looked like when you walk into an AIDS clinic in like Jos, Nigeria, it looks like the Department of Motor Vehicles here in Chicago. I mean, it's massive. It's huge, just gigantic. We had bought them a FibroScan machine. They did FibroScans. It's a machine that measures the stiffness of the liver. We didn't even have it here. They had it there. They just scanned everybody. I mean, like it was wild. Those clinics, they ultimately filled up, and they realized too that they couldn't. Just like me when I started treating the patients here. I mean, I just couldn't see any more patients. I mean, I can't work. There's only so many hours in the day. So they started setting up satellites. And PEPFAR expanded to 1.5 and 2.0 and started really spreading things out more as the supply chain issues got worked out. At the beginning, they couldn't do anymore. That we could barely do what we were doing. So at the end, and this is approximate, we had 55 actually clinical sites, approximately 55. And we treated somewhere around 175,000 people, give or take.
So those
25,000.
Those new clinical sites.
There were smaller clinics, some faith-based clinics, some smaller hospital clinics.
So they're being set up by different entities and coming under the PEPFAR umbrella.
Yeah, they got set up under the PEPFAR umbrella.
Okay.
We set up, so those, but our 6 main sites actually set those sites up.
Okay.
Yeah. And then they could handle it because you just can't put everybody. It's hard moving around there. If you have an hour drive each way, it's not easy. And at the beginning, we didn't know how often people should be seen. The treatments were not that easy, not like they are today, where it's 1 pill once a day. And so the patients were back and forth to the clinic quite a bit, especially at the beginning.
Right. So you mentioned some of the new clinics, are connected to faith-based organizations. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because that, again, was another part of the kind of PEPFAR design, was the involvement of faith-based organizations.
Yeah. So, because everything that we did was owned by the government. All the universities were government universities, and then plus the military. So the faith-based hospitals, for instance, Catholic charities, or it's not Catholic charity, Catholic Relief Group is a Track 1 PEPFAR recipient. They actually are involved in 25% of all the medical care in Africa, or this is what they used to claim. So many, many faith-based churches and clinics were all over Africa. So we utilized them, existing clinics, and we just took them under the umbrella, and we became, our big main sites became kind of the parent site for those clinics. And we helped them do or test the viral load, for example, or CD4 counts, or build up their lab capacity to what it could potentially be. And after a while, we learned that maybe we're over monitoring people. So we learned a lot from them because maybe we don't have to monitor as much as we did. And so working with them was fine. And we worked with Catholic Relief, and then the other PEPFAR players came in, and everyone worked pretty well together. There was plenty of work to do, so there was really not any competition. But we were the first ones to transfer all the power to the local leaders.
And this is probably more of an observational question than a kind of expertise. But Nigeria is a very kind of multi-religious nation, right? And so, what's it look like for Catholic Relief Services to run a clinic, and does that impact where various parts of the population go for service?
Yeah, well, the Catholic Relief is a bottom-up organization. So the Catholic Relief Service is an umbrella that just helps any faith-based service. They have Hindu hospitals, Hindu-supported hospitals, Coptic Christians, Catholics, a number of Protestant denominations support some kind of clinic somewhere. And they've been doing that for a long time. This is nothing new, all right? So this just enhanced what was already going on out there, because they couldn't handle the patients either.
Right.
They can't just, if they don't treat them, they're gonna die. So they got on board pretty quickly. But it's Catholic Relief, or at least my impression of it was, it's not a big top-down group. It's more they're the umbrella that keeps a lot of those faith-based organizations alive, and they lobby for them, and help with some kind of inter-hospital communications and structure. It's whatever kind of works. It's very different from the university approach, which we were really based in. But we had many faith-based little clinics that we dealt with and helped, and it was fine. They provide a lot of the care in Africa.
Well, and then I was thinking about the kind of parts of the country for like Muslim majority. Were there the equivalents of that?
Well, let's just say there's not that. There are some kind of religious hospitals and clinics all over the country, even in the more Muslim areas. I would say there's fewer, but Nigeria is, and I don't know if this is representative of the other countries so much, because I know more about Nigeria than the other ones, but Nigeria is approximately 50-50 Christian and 50% Muslim. It's not like all the Muslims are here and all the Christians are there. So everywhere you go, there's 20 to 49% or another religion. So there's more mixture than you think. Now, there are more Muslims in the north, and there are more Christians in the south, and there's more Catholics over here, and there's more Protestants over here. There are some differences, but when we first were going there was really no problems. We didn't have any problems anywhere. But as time went on, we started having problems, and particularly up in Maiduguri, things got a little tough, and there were sort of jihad type people coming in from the northeast through southern Libya and Chad into that northeast corner, Borno State. And after a while, we couldn't go there anymore. We were advised not to, that the Americans shouldn't go there.
Yeah. Basically,
so we didn't, but we continued to supply them, but we had to send only Nigerians there. We were not allowed to go. Right. But that's the only place. The other places, Zaria, for example, is a very Muslim area, and I had the best with all the DGs, the director generals of the hospitals. I had to work with them because we were rehabbing their clinics and building stuff. And the best relationship I had was my colleague Ogui. He's up in Amado Bello in Zaria, which is the mostly Muslim part, and he was just great. I said, look, we cannot build a building from scratch. But we can take a building that has a foundation and at least a standing wall or two, and we can remodel it. And that's within that's the rules of the U.S. government for this program. So we did remodeling. So he didn't have like a slab of concrete anywhere. So I said, look, build a slab of concrete and put up a couple walls, and then invite us back and we'll evaluate it and remodel it. And he said, and I said, and then we can even pay rent because you own the property. So PEPFAR doesn't own anything.
Right.
We give everything away. So he said, that's a great deal. And so he did. And he has like one of the best clinics. But it was really, that was a really fun one because he built the concrete slab, and then he's built a wall, and he sent an architect out with me. And the guy is like, he's like building a hospital ward. I said, no. This is outpatients, And, a lot of people have tuberculosis, so you have to make it, the ventilation has to be really good, So I said, here's where you walk in. People that are coughing have to go sit out on a patio. The rest of them just check in, get weighed, and then they go into the consultation rooms, and then they go to the laboratory, and then they pick up their drugs. So, there's just a circuit, and then they leave through another door. It was fun. I got to design clinics that actually worked. Some of them just tried to try to shove things into existing structures. That's okay. You make it work. But I actually liked it when we actually built them.
Yeah. Were there other kinds of, I'm thinking about like your kind of day-to-day implementations, right? That required that kind of creativity or?
Well, we would always go in to look at the patient flow and to make sure that there was good airflow and that patients weren't too crowded and that they were doing the data monitoring and, that they were turning in their reports on time. Yeah, we just were like doing the oversight to make sure everything was going well and that there were people actually working there. And the places were always very busy. We paid the investigators, compared to what we pay here in the West, we were paying, it's a very modest amount. And people were happy to have that extra money. And so we got incredibly good service, and they did a great job taking care of the patients. It had a dramatic impact on the overall lives of people with HIV in all those PEPFAR countries.
And all of the people trained, right?
All the people trained.
Yeah.
And it didn't stop there. As I mentioned, it became MEPI, it became these research training programs, it became, other research grants for them, implementation projects in public health, other diseases and everything. It's just really grown.
So you mentioned, there's this change over time, right? As the infrastructure builds up, as the both human and kind of physical infrastructure is built up and kind of transferred over, that changes practice, and it changes also the types of research and relationships that you can have. What are some of the kind of like research things that have come out of your work with PEPFAR?
Oh yeah, so for us, really, well, in 3 areas. So one is in TB, and especially TB diagnostics. So we're working, really, it's very hard to diagnose TB in people with HIV and in pediatrics. It's just tough because it's hard to get the samples. So we've got some very sensitive tests and assays that we've developed and working with the Nigerians. We actually developed 3 biomedical engineering departments at the universities, 2 in Nigeria and 1 in Mali, another country where we work that's very different. And we've partnered with Stellenbosch University, which has a really great TB program and diagnostic program. So TB and TB diagnostics has been a big thing. Then HIV-associated cancers is another thing. We just published a paper, just like I got noticed yesterday, on finding a marker in the blood for potentially for hepatocellular carcinoma. So that is a great thing, and that's just kind of tangentially related to HIV because everybody with that doesn't necessarily have HIV. So cervical cancer, the same thing. So we've done the TB work, the cancer work, and then the biomedical engineering work, which really can translate to anything that's needed. The Africans are never going to want a system as complicated as we have here in making a diagnosis. You know, nobody thinks, you know, doctors' offices and clinics, you know, they put, you know, their specimens in a little bucket, they get picked up by some transport company. Who knows where the test is even being done? It could be done in the suburbs of Chicago. It could be flown to Indianapolis, or I mean, all sorts of stuff happens. It can be done in the lab here. You know, it's not going to happen like that there. So a focus more on point of care technologies, whether it's not necessarily over the counter, but you can actually do the test there and easy and more simple and cheaper. And that has been really rewarding. We actually published the first book about biomedical engineering in Africa because we really think that not only do they have to make the drugs there, but they have to develop the devices that are going to be used there to help their own people because they're going to do it cheaper, better, faster. There's no reason why we have to do it any faster here because the whole system is set up. It's very expensive, but it's like it exists. There's almost no incentive to do it cheaper, better, faster here. Mm-hmm. Whereas there, it has to be cheaper, better, faster. So those are the three pillars of what this whole thing has really led in terms of what I'm doing.
That's great. That's great. Well, so as you look back on your time in Nigeria and this really amazing career, you know, what are some of your proudest accomplishments? And on the other hand, what are some of the ones that you look back and you're like, oh, I really wish I had handled that differently?
Well, I think I look back on my career, and PEPFAR definitely was one of the things that was the most important in my career. Before that, just developing the HIV clinical program here was really great. I'm very proud of that work. Being here right at the beginning and treating all these patients, I'll never forget it. Yeah. I see patients to this day. Yeah. Every Monday afternoon when I'm in town. So, you know, being in the AIDS treatment world, publishing a few papers here and there, to moving to an huge implementation project, PEPFAR, and then doing about the middle of my career, then I started doing all the really research work. My work has been myself, I've been about 90% funded by the NIH and research since PEPFAR ended. So I'm very proud of that and all the projects, and then how all our partners did. I think one way to illustrate that was when COVID came around. Two things really happened. One is the NIH and all the other funders were really nervous, like, what is going to happen? How are you going to finish these projects? And, you know, how are you going to do that from here? We can't travel, we can't do this. And they were saying, we'll give you automatic no-cost extension because you're never going to be able to finish during the pandemic. We finished everything right on time. All we did was just switch to Zoom and phone calls. And we had trained the people on the ground so well for HIV and everything. Of course, it works for everything. They finished everything. Yeah. We did not skip a beat. We spent all the funds. We finished every single project during the pandemic. So that was one thing. Yeah. The other thing was we took the engineering part that we had done, and we were part of a program called RADx, Rapid Acceleration of Diagnostics for Coronavirus, RADx. We were asked as part of, this is the alphabet soup here, POCTRN, Point of Care Technologies Research Network. So this is what's funding all this point of care diagnostics that were in assay monitoring in Africa. So the POCTRN people said, okay, besides finishing your regular job here, we want you to work on COVID tests. So, okay, they said, we're going to accelerate this. So it reminded me very much of PEPFAR, how fast that went. And they did the same thing with RADx. They did the same thing with Operation Warp Speed, which you probably heard about, developing the vaccine. You know, vaccine got developed in 10 months. It was amazing. So Radex was the same way. So here, I don't know if you remember, in like March, April of 2020, you couldn't get a COVID test if your life depended on it.
Yeah.
Of course, what could you do? Well, through another program at the NIH, they developed the first drug, remdesivir. And then through Radex, they, again, poured the money into all these companies, big companies, medium companies, little companies. Even Northwestern had a startup company. Poured the money in there, and within a year, we were responsible for increasing the number of tests from almost 0 to 8 million tests per day, and the first over-the-counter test for COVID. And guess what's happened? Okay, COVID, all right, it's morphed into kind of an influenza-like situation, but all that technology and all that energy has started a whole thing for like Radex HIV. Maybe we can have a point-of-care test for HIV viral load. Maybe we can have a point-of-care test for things related to maternal fetal care, to other diseases. This whole point-of-care technology thing, maybe it can really involve many other diseases unrelated to infectious diseases. So that has been that's just a huge thing. And a lot of people don't realize how impactful the US government was in developing these tests. If we hadn't done it, it would have just been so, I don't know where we would be. We would not be where we are today. And we're still funding companies at a very high level of multiplex testing. So you, instead of going in to test yourself for COVID, you're going to get flu A, flu B, COVID, and RSV in one little swab that you put into a thing. 15 minutes later, you're going to have the result. Mm-hmm. So how does that tie in with PEPFAR? Well, our PEPFAR site, our PEPFAR sites and sites in our engineering program also started to store samples that could be tested. And they took 200 samples from Stellenbosch University, one of our sites, went into the national database here to be used for testing to see if there's something different about the samples in Africa compared to the ones in the US. And so we've incorporated them into the whole schema of things. So, and Omicron was identified at Stellenbosch. Yeah. And a lot of the pathogens are coming out of places that are not in the United States. So, we've added to the whole surveillance capacity for the entire United States. And I hope that continues. We don't know what's going to happen, but I hope that continues because that's where the action is happening.
Yeah. I think you answered that question. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions about the recent evolutions of PEPFAR, and then a couple of reflective questions for wrapping things up. Have you paid attention to the American reauthorization of PEPFAR over the different presidential?
There's a question what's going on right now, and I hope they don't stop it. I think it's been remarkable what's gone on, and right now is not the time to look away from Africa. I already mentioned, you got a lot of hot spots in Africa where anything could happen. I mean, look what's happened already. Ebola. Yeah. You've got other viruses, Zika in Latin America. You've got chikungunya. You've got all these other pathogens that are floating around out there. You now have some 100 people who have died suddenly in southern Congo. Nobody even knows why. How do 100 people just die? It's like we have to keep our finger on the pulse. The other thing with Africa that is so important is that all the other continents other than Africa are going to be losing population very soon. Already Europe is losing. We're going to lose. We're not going to keep up. Latin America the same. Even India has leveled off. And look what's happened in China. China has a crisis on its hand. to have so many old people because they're so used to having one kid. And now that they put the incentive out there to have more than one kid, the people are not taking it up. They're never going to get back to replacement. It's not going to happen. India's next, will go down. North America, we're barely going to keep up. But we used to barely keep up because we took so many immigrants, and we have so many illegal immigrants, and we have all the DACA, million kids, whatever, adults. Now, if all those go away, there's a big chunk of the U.S. population that's in life-bearing years that's going to leave. Yeah. Africa is not following this model. They've got a little over 1 billion people right now, and they're projected to double already by the late 2030s, and by 2050 it'll be more than double. So they're going to be increasing into the billions, and everybody else is going to be going down. So that's one thing. So it's a population dynamic thing. The other thing is many of the world's important minerals and stuff are located in Africa. Lithium and uranium and all these other metals and everything. They have a huge oil deposits as well. Angola, Nigeria, Cameroon now. Equatorial Guinea has, tons of oil. They're very rich in resources. So it's important that we stay engaged with Africa. They still have, obviously a long way to go. But I saw just last week, that Biden announced $600 billion to build a railroad. I think it's in Angola to Congo, sort of in that direction. That was a first, because it's mostly been the Chinese building the railroads and everything. So it's interesting to see that finally the Americans are putting in some infrastructure, other than just military advice and PEPFAR. So the PEPFAR is like soft money, and the military stuff is military stuff.
Right.
But like everywhere I go in Africa, the Chinese are building roads, railroads. They built the railroad from Mombasa to Nairobi. They're building the subway in Dar es Salaam, I think. There's all sorts of, the Chinese are all over the place. And I think if we want to, this is going to be a very important part of the world, and there may be more people there at some point than here. I think we need to, engage with them and keep the engagement strong, and giving them a healthier life and longevity, I think, is just a step in the right direction. I mean, it's the money we spent on healthcare there is really not very high, and it's had a huge impact because they don't do it as inefficiently as we do. And already the world's lifespan is over 70, but that's the average, But in Africa, many of the places we work, it's like around 60 or so. Africa has a very young population. The median age in Africa, in most places in Africa, is 18. It's a median. It's 38 here. So, that's a huge difference. And that's here it's going to get higher.
Right.
There it hasn't budged. But I work in one other country too, quite a bit, in Mali. So there's other issues. Mali is 90% Muslim, 10% Christian. They just threw the French out. But they have jihadist groups in the north, and it's just crazy. We still go there. Bamako, the capital, is safe. We've had a very good relation. We've been working with them for 25 years. And we're not going to give up on them. And they just started a biomedical engineering program this year. I was very proud of that. That's the third one we started. And on a per capita basis, they're tremendously successful in getting U.S. government grants. Amazing. because it's only 20 million people. So they're just, from the health standpoint, things are really going in the right direction there for a country as poor as that.
Yeah, no, that's, thank you for that. So a couple of wrap-up questions, and you've spoken a little bit about this, but, kind of reflecting back, PEPFAR does have this, this place in world history, that really kind of brings people together. And so, can you just kind of reflect on, the bonds that have been created by it and all the good that has been done?
HIV is a pandemic, and it's different from all the other pandemics in that it's lifelong and requires treatment lifelong, and that there's no vaccine. And there's no vaccine on the horizon. We've been saying, there'll be a vaccine. I remember when I first started working with HIV in the mid-'80s, the dean, Harry Beattie, he was an infectious disease doctor here. And he said, why are you wasting your time working with HIV? He goes, they're going to have a vaccine in a couple of years and you can not have anything to do. I didn't listen to him. And he was wrong. And some schools have taken the approach that they don't want to, HIV is a flash in the pan, whatever. And obviously that's not the case. And everybody that gets diagnosed has to be treated for life. So that's the difference. And that's why the overall capacity for healthcare has to continue forever, as long as you have this giant pool of people with HIV, because they're always going to have HIV. If you stop, they're all going to die. Every one of them is going to die. Life expectancy in the United States with no treatment used to be 10 years, and in Africa was about 6 or 7. So you just want all those people to die? So it changed the whole public health kind of field to think, we can't just think about, okay, we can eradicate river blindness, we can eradicate, maybe we can eradicate polio, maybe. Not doing very well lately, but, we have a potential. Maybe we can eradicate measles if we could all get on the same page. We can do things together to eradicate some nasty diseases. But with HIV, even if we stop, there's still more new cases per year than deaths. So the overall number of people with HIV is still increasing in the United States and worldwide. It hasn't gone over that hump yet. We're hoping the capsid inhibitor treatment, where you give the injection just twice a year, that's going to have a major impact, and that can be, cost of goods is about $40 supposedly. So of course there's thousands, but you got to pay for the development. But in terms of getting the epidemic really down to a dull roar and get it, all it has to do is start going down. If it goes down and we don't give up our mitigations, it will go away. That's what happens. It may take decades, but it'll go away. But we've got to get over that hump with HIV. PEPFAR is very important. To bail out of PEPFAR now is so short-sighted. It's just, it saddens me to think that would happen. Yeah. Because it doesn't take much more than what we're doing to get that down. We need this treatment and all this other stuff, but we can't just, if we walk away now, we're a big player in the AIDS treatment world. We made a massive impact around the world and in our own country. And it would just be, it would really be a terrible waste to see that happen. Now, there's other people out there with responsibilities. There's the European Union, even China, even other players that can step in. The British do some stuff, the Wellcome Foundation, other foundations. I mean, there are other players. It's not just the U.S. If you look at research, though, 2/3 of research in Africa is the United States.
Okay. So in an ideal world in which PEPFAR is not only maintained, but also there's room for growth, what would you see as kind of opportunities for PEPFAR to kind of expand its work in terms of global health?
Well, they have to focus on getting over the hump of the curve. They have to start seeing a decline in the number of AIDS cases and then not give up. If they start, one fear is that if we see a decline, people will pull back the funding. Well, then you're going to go like this. So it's going to take a concerted effort. Now, everybody has to play their part. And these countries are not necessarily poor. They have resources, and they've got to step to the plate too. There is some movement now that, saying, 5% or 2% of the health spending should be for research and, implementation work, whatever. I mean, pick a number. It doesn't matter. I mean, there's got to be something. They've got to be putting, besides just the care, they have to also, get involved in figuring out the best way to either deliver a product or to end a disease. Mm-hmm. So that has to, they have a big play in this. But I mean, look what happened after Ebola. So Ebola comes out, 10,000 people died. It's terrible, but it's just Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. But because of Ebola, they started the African CDC. So that was a major step in the right direction. So now you have this outbreak in southern Congo. Nobody knows what it is. African CDC, the first thing I see in the newspaper, African CDC sends people down there to investigate. They can investigate. They can investigate themselves. They probably have a representative in the DRC, Congo, and they could go down there, and they've already started looking. I follow that every day, because this is something that could be scary. So the first reports now are that, well, it's an area that has a severe malnutrition problem right now. The people are very malnourished, and so they're set up for other infections. There's all sorts of other stuff going on. They're not even sure it's a new pathogen or it's just an old pathogen. I mean, it's influenza or, they don't know what it is. So, but at least there's people looking right away. So this is all good. I mean, look at for Mpox. It's still going on in Congo. Over 1,000 people have died. But the only way Mpox is going to get extinguished is with the vaccine or some kind of treatment. So, it took months to get the first batches of vaccine sent there. That was a little disappointing how long that took. But it started. And they've actually calculated they need about 10 million doses, and that ought to do it. So, but at least there is movement in the right direction. It's not all bad.
Okay. Well, is there anything else, kind of related to PEPFAR that you want to talk about that we might have missed?
Well, it's truly one of the greatest public health programs that ever existed. There's never been anything like it. And I think it's very important that it continues until the HIV epidemic is wiped out, and that will happen.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.